Sadly, however, there were people on all sides who were looking to exploit, the tragedy of what happened. I believe the
Yeah.
first quote we have comes from a gender critical by the name of Gay Chapman. Do you want me to read this out?
I can
Okay,
read
okay,
it since you've got all the other stories to worry about.
okay.
Yes, Gay Chapman said, quote, "What I feared is happening. People are getting hurt. A woman lost her life protecting other women. Of course, our ideological opponents are blaming GC women slash radical feminists slash lesbians for this act of violence. I have seen up close and personal, out of control women slash kids screeching slash tambourining at the turfs. They take their cues from men who threaten and love controlling you women. If you are one of these women, stop and think. The time for the TRAs to back off is now, if not sooner. The number of women working together to preserve our spaces in sports, prisons, and hospital wards is growing. It's not anti-trans, it's pro-woman. Everyone sees what these fuckers have done to gays and lesbians, from promoting the affirming gender care to our LGBT youth to popularizing trans in social media, pushing the trans narrative to confused parents, vilifying every lesbian who speaks out or rejects dick 100%. End quote.
Which, a wonderful way to celebrate the memory of a trans man who was just fucking murdered. Of course, I'm being
Yeah,
sarcastic
lovely
here.
misgendering there and demonizing men when a man just
Mhm,
died trying to protect a couple of queer women,
mhm.
and attacking trans people when a trans person just died trying to protect queer women.
You can understand why the fucking gender critical crowd is so fucking terrified of this being linked to them, because they have spent years and years trying to create this climate of hostility towards trans people. You know, they are, in large part, responsible for this. As the mayor noted, things are getting worse. That's thanks to people who are members of the gender critical movement, which, reminder, is an extension of just old school fascism. You know, it's not allied with fascism. It's not, people being misled or misguided by fascists. It is just straight up old school fascism repackaged and branded with progressive sounding language, you know. Um, and it has created this ripple effect throughout Europe we've seen where many countries have become, you know, less queer friendly over time. UK being the extreme example, but it has been happening elsewhere as well. Um, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add on this.
No, I think you've covered that well.
Mm.
So I guess it's not
Sadly,
just the gender criticals um, who have awful things to say about this,
mhm,
but also trans people. Mallory Moore, who
I've had
we
previous
had a
run-ins.
run-in.
Yeah, sure, I can
I
go over
don't
this.
remember. Can you
I do.
can you take
We
this
had a
one?
previous run-in with her regarding Sophie Labelle. If you don't remember, we did a show on Sophie Labelle when it was revealed that she was using real photographs of children to draw sexualized images. Mallory Moore was someone who I saw liking posts defending Sophie Labelle. I just moved away from her at that point. And then when I did my post detailing everything, because the only people I saw sharing evidence were far right spaces, and as a CSA survivor, that wasn't right to me. I didn't want people sharing, like being forced to choose between not noting that Sophie Labelle has done this and sharing far right sources. So I created a leftist source to be shared to let people know that, hey, Sophie Labelle is a predator. She sexualizes minors. Um, Mallory Moore came out of nowhere and started like targeting how I went about things. Not defending Sophie Labelle outright, but criticizing the way I'd done things. Even though, again, I had noted that Mallory Moore had been going around liking posts defending Sophie Labelle. So I would caught onto it immediately. It was completely bad faith. She was criticizing the way I did things, not because she genuinely cared about how my post impacted anybody. Like I didn't provide full content warnings on all the images. I did a content warning at the start of the post, and this is back before we had spoiled images. I wish we had the spoiled images that we now have on Twitter. We actually stated, I wish Twitter had a spoiler image feature like on Discord. Lo and behold, we now do. So she came after me on these like smaller points, and I just wasn't having any of it. I just told her, I've seen you liking all these other posts. You can just fuck off. I know exactly what you're doing. So we've had a previous one with her before. That's like worth mentioning. But yeah, she decided that she needed to have her voice heard on the deathless trans man, which leads us on to the quote.
Yes, she said, quote, "Hold up. Why are trans masks seemingly quite widely reheating a trans version of MRA rhetoric? To be clear, because this discourse has played out 1,000,000 times over men and class, men and race, men and disability, men and sexuality, I don't think trans men have the same status as cisgender men. I'm alarmed by the apparent enthusiasm to reinvent a men's rights politics. You can compare and contrast James Barry's entry versus Elizabeth Edwards in Alfred Swain Taylor's Forensic Medical Jurisprudence book from the 19th century to understand that transmisogyny has deep roots. This is why we have intersectional feminist theory on it. Like, there's something specifically demonic about trans women in the eyes of cisgender people. We are traps and have been traps for centuries. In before someone points out that this is historical anti-trans masculinity. Yes, my whole point is that what people are calling anti-trans masculinity is transphobia when it's applied to men/masks, rather than the bizarre hypersexualized demonization with trans women. End quote.
It's worth noting that Moore didn't post this in response to anything particular, but she would then later go on to confirm that she was targeting a post in which a trans man was talking about the lack of reaction surrounding Malta's murder. And there's a quote from that post that I just want to read out because it makes something very clear. The post specifically states, and I do quote, "I want to be exceptionally clear that this thread is not about trans femmes. Anti-trans masculinity is an oppressive force like any other and can be internalized or weaponized. This is a thread about how we as a trans community can do better." End quote.
Another person chiming in was Natalie Reed of Free Thought Blogs, who we previously had run-ins with this person as well.
Yeah, I've had run-ins with a lot of these people.
Yeah.
First, it was with the whole Sophie Labelle thing. She was there as well, defending Sophie Labelle. And then more recently, she's been there mocking the Black trans community in regards to the whole Kefl's racism situation. So, just in general, there's just a handful of like 10 or 20, white trans women who just have a routine of like putting down trans men, putting down, Black trans people, putting down pretty much anybody that doesn't fit their stereotype of, white, powerful trans women. So yes, that's another person who decided to get involved.
Wonderful. And she said, quote, "Yeah, but what about male rape victims? Why do you not talk about that, but for transes?" End quote.
Mm-hmm.
And Catherine Scorned responded to a Black trans man criticizing this Moore's post, and she said, quote, "You're making someone being murdered about your quasi-MRA internet persecution complex. Jesus fucking Christ." End quote. And so, oh my God, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yes.
I hope you're comfortable and that you have a nice hot drink or a cold drink, depending on what season it is for you. So first of all, because this whole MRA thing comes up a lot, not just with this, but like literally anytime trans men suggest that trans men should be treated better or not be treated badly or have a problem that should be addressed, we get called MRAs. Like, cis men do not get called MRAs this often. It's just I'm sick of it, honestly.
Do you want me to take this one actually, because I was there throughout Gamergate. I personal experience of like MRAs, how they interact, what kind of defines their rhetoric, if you like.
Yeah, sure. If there's anything I feel like is worth adding, I can
Yeah.
say that at the end.
So, like, one of the main things about MRAs is the fact that they were not anything about men's rights. They did not care about men's rights. They didn't actually do anything about men's rights. It's important that the way MRAs operated is they didn't create their own communities and spaces to actually talk about how they could better things for men. They just targeted feminists who were talking, of course, about women. You know, they would find posts in which feminists talked about women who had suffered rape. They would turn up, and as the post mocking, the trans man who was murdered in this instance and was being talked about in the fucking news, on their own, specifically about them, MRAs would turn up and would go, well, what about male rape? Meanwhile, when you checked what these MRIs were saying on, say, posts in which teachers raped children, female teachers raped male children, these same MRAs would be turning up going, what a lucky boy. Where were these teachers when I was at school? At least if the teacher was conventionally attractive. There was no actual care for men there. Feminists had no actual issue working with people, trying to make, things better for men by getting more mental health services, access to rape crisis centers, stuff like that. I actually remember back at university, we had a feminist society, and the person I founded the Atheist Human Secular Society, he was someone who called himself a men's health specialist because he would have loved to have taken MRA as a term, but he felt it would just be made so fucking toxic by the internet culture that he couldn't. He was someone specifically going into psychology to learn about domestic abuse because he wanted to help and volunteer and work with services specifically for male victims of domestic abuse. And the feminist society would invite him in and would have him give talks, and they were completely happy with that. There are men genuinely working to better men without attacking feminists, and that is an important distinction. It's the same thing. MRAs are to the needs of men. I won't say rights of men, but the needs of men regarding mental health services, regarding domestic violence services, sexual assault services. They are to them what the LGBT Alliance is to LGBT plus people, or what TERFs are to feminism. They do not care. They only pretend to care as an argument and attempt to disparage people who are trying to help others. But that is not what is happening here. Trans men, trans masks were talking about someone they lost, someone that, died trying to protect others. They created their own spaces, their own threads. They were talking about that. And this person, all of these people, they came along and they inserted themselves into that conversation. So yes, I don't know if you want to build on that.
I do just want to point out that almost at the same time, you and Higgins both said the thing about MRAs help men as much as the LGBT Alliance helps gay people. Cursed minds think alike.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess the thing that gets me every time trans men, well, not every single time, but most of the times trans men are called MRAs, you would be forgiven for thinking from the way these people talk that an MRA is someone who cares about men and wants them to be okay and healthy and happy and wants the world to be a better place, and just happens to focus on men.
Yeah.
And they talk about this like it's a bad thing.
It's not.
If MRAs acted like this, then MRAs would not have ever been a problem.
Yeah.
But of course, Catherine showed everyone's whole show what they're actually thinking by specifically about referencing the whole what about male rape victims thing. So this is equivocation. They're very much doing this on purpose. They're taking this really toxic, this term with this very toxic associations, MRA, And they're saying, well, oh, look, you're actually advocating for men's rights. As we know from this term, men's rights activists are bad, and
Mhm,
therefore you're bad. And I mean, all I can really say to that is, if you do this, I hope horrible things happen to you.
mhm.
Fuck you. Um, that yeah,
And the thing is, you'd think they'd be more sympathetic to it, because, like, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but I absolutely refused to call myself a trans rights activist. And the reason I fucking refuse to do that is because the gender critical crowd has made that term toxic by doing the exact same fucking equivocation. You know,
mm,
the TRAs, that's what they call us. That's why they, they made the acronym. It's because they want to associate us with MRAs. They're trying to
mm,
make out that specifically in this case, trans women, fighting for women's rights. They're actually men just pretending to be women, and therefore it's just an extension of this thing.
mm,
And you think that that would give people like, you think it give these people some fucking compassion and insight, but it doesn't, that they never stop to reflect on these things. Like, again, we see how there's a difference between actually, wanting to care for LGBT people and what the LGBT alliance is. We can see there's a difference and we can understand that nuance. Just because the LGBT alliance exists doesn't mean, people don't actually care about LGBT people. Or just because TERFs exist doesn't mean that there are actual feminists out there. We can understand that. That's nuance we can get. But we can't get nuance when it comes to trans men or even men in general, you know.
mm.
The moment it even vaguely swerves in that direction, oh, MRA rhetoric, we gotta demonize it as that. So yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, no, it's fine. Um, oh, I had a point and then I'm blanked. Oh yeah, actually, one thing I couldn't help but think about as well was um, during International Men's Day,
Mhm,
there were a bunch of posts that were along the lines of, "Oh, why do men need an International Men's Day? They're really privileged." Well, you see, men have all sorts of issues with, mental health and toxic masculinity, and restrictive gender roles and stuff like that that need awareness that they need to work through. And so it's good to have a day to talk about that. And when
mhm,
cis men did talk about those things, I'm not saying cis men don't deal with this, because this absolutely does affect cis men as well. I've
yeah.
seen, uh, but not as much. Um, when cis men were talking about these issues, they got all sorts of praise, like, "Oh my God, you're deconstructing the toxic masculinity. You're so great." But when trans men try to advocate for ourselves or try to promote healthy masculinity or anything positive, "Oh, you're MRAs, how dare you care about men?"
Mhm,
Uh, Something else I want to point out as well is this whole MRA thing. This is the definition of punishing a marginalized group for cis men's behavior.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, they're basically saying cis men did all these awful things, and this is like vaguely reminiscent of that if you don't think about it at all. So, how dare you?
Do you know who
And
also gets punished that way when it comes to bathroom access and everything else? Trans women.
hmm,
Again, it's just one of those things that you think you'd have a little more fucking sympathy, but sadly, no, that goes out the window. Uh,
yeah, and that's something I'm not saying that I'm not going to say that this isn't a problem, because there's
mm,
huge problems with punishing bi people for what people imagine cis men are going to do, punishing ace people for what people imagine cis men are going to do. But there generally is quite a loud acknowledgement as well that those arguments are wrong.
mm,
But it's really difficult to find people saying that it's wrong to do this to trans men. And if you do say it's wrong, then you're called an MRA and you're called a toxic misogynist and transmisogynist, and how dare you?
mm.
And
It's
yeah,
all.
it's maddening when you can't even find support in your own community, and you
Mhm.
can't even support each other without getting harassment from your own community.
We saw it earlier, like the person in talking, like the trans man talking about the murder of another trans man, felt they needed to add a disclaimer that they weren't going
Mm,
after trans femme people. That shows off a fucked up mentality. Like they shouldn't have to add that disclaimer. You know,
mm.
they shouldn't need to. We shouldn't exist in a world where they have to do that. But that is how commonplace it is. Trans men are changing their behavior. They're adapting their behavior in our community because of how they're treated. You know, um, and
Oh, okay. Sorry.
so go
Did
on,
you have?
go on. No, 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 go on.
Yeah, that kind of leads into the next point, which is making trans masculine, trans femme oppression a competition.
Mhm,
Uh, yeah, I've dealt with lots and lots of issues with how to talk about what trans men go through, because no matter what you do, people will find some way to say you're being a trans misogynist. If you don't talk about trans women at all, you're being a trans misogynist because you're not considering trans women. If you talk about how transmisandry it mutually reinforces trans misogyny or can impact trans women as well, then you're saying that trans men are affected by trans misogyny. If you say that uh, the way trans men are treated has parallels with how trans women are treated, and so we can uh, come together in solidarity over that, then you're a trans misogynist because you're saying trans men have it as bad as trans women.
mhm.
Um, Yet, no matter what you do, you're somehow minimizing trans women's oppression or saying trans women are oppressing trans men. There's just no winning. And with what happened here specifically in Mallory Moore's post, you can see that, because the thing is, if you are aware of this, if you're aware of the pitfalls of making it sound in any way like you're comparing trans men's issues to trans women's, you will know that you do not want to risk it sounding like you're making it a competition, or risk saying something that could be interpreted that way. You just
Yeah.
steer clear of it, because you will get some really bad hate. But the thing is, even if you make sure to never mention trans women, other people will just make it into a competition for you.
Yeah.
Mallory Moore, of course, did this whole thing about how trans misogyny is so bad and has these deep roots, and how trans men are demonized as badly.
Yeah.
And like, nobody asked. This was completely uninvited. This would be like if I went onto a random trans women's post and was like, look at this example of a trans man experiencing bigotry in the 1800s. Transmisandry is so bad. Why are you even talking about this?
If you,
And like,
so,
yeah, there's no good way to respond to this. If you take the bait, then it's like, how dare you make this a competition?
mhm.
And then if you don't, then it's like, oh, you're not responding to my point, and
Yeah,
it's just a
it's
clusterfuck.
defined. It's almost like, well, if you're a trans woman or trans femme person and you don't attempt to adhere to society's like gender norms, well, you're clearly not trying. You're a faker. You're transgender, and you're just trying to invade women's spaces. If you do, then you're upholding the patriarchy and gender norms and values. You know, the goal is to make it that you can't win. Like any action you
Mm.
do outside of just ceasing to exist and ceasing to speak about your experience is a violation, you know.
Yeah.
It's
And it's
yeah.
also just so, the extremely frustrating thing is all of these standards that are being set for us. You're
Mm,
this evil, horrible, disgusting, toxic misogynist and trans misogynist if you do these things. We're
mm,
constantly having these things done to us. Like, don't make it a competition, but people are constantly coming to us and making it a competition.
yeah. It's just the
Uh,
insertion of like just insertion of trans women into trans men's issues because like
hmm,
it's not a case of these trans women were talking about something and then this trans man died and like people suddenly ran over to their post talking about trans women and started bringing up this one trans man. No, people were putting out posts about trans men. They're the ones who came in and started attacking them for that and started trying to turn the focus onto them, how bad things are for them. They're the ones running in. The neutral example we used to use before we had, when we were dealing with MRAs, was we actually took it on good faith that they actually did care about men's rights and just show just how absurd what they are doing in general is. Even if they did actually care, they are still going about things the wrong fucking way. The neutral example we used was a cancer doctor running into a heart attack conference demanding that everybody stop and drop their stuff and start, researching cancer instead. It doesn't fucking matter the fact that cancer is like a legitimate, disease, concern, etc., that needs help and support, etc. That doesn't matter. It's the fact that you're going in and you're invading the space that has been set up by people impacted by this issue, staying in their fucking lane, talking about what impacts them. You're the one going in. You're the one kicking the door down. You're the one derailing the conversation. Okay? These people are all guilty of the very thing they are accusing trans men of.
Yeah, that's the thing that really, really annoys me is if you look at the actual behavior, they're the ones acting like MRAs. But because, if you're a man and they're a woman, then you're an MRA because of your gender. They're not going to look at your actual behavior. They're not going to look at what's going on.
And it's the exact same optics that TERFs use. It's the exact same optics they use. The whole thing of, the 60-year-old woman was assaulted in Hyde Park by, two men. That's the optics they used. And they do it all the time.
And this isn't the first time that this... the first time I talked about Transmisandry when I independently came up with the term was because I called Billy Orchard out on defending sexual assault. And her response was, how dare you as a man lecture me as a woman on sexual assault?
Yeah.
Ignoring that I'm a CSA survivor. I have experience with sexual assault. I was assigned female at birth and was assaulted because of that. And that I had a whole bunch of sources and research backing me up. She was like, but you're a man, so you're mansplaining, you're a misogynist, you don't know what you're talking about. And it keeps fucking happening to trans men, even when people know they're trans men, even when there was people going after a trans man who has, I'm a trans man in their bio or whatever, because it's just complete fucking bad faith. It's just this idea of men are in the wrong, men are violent, men are bigoted.
These people need to learn standpoint feminism, which is like, standpoint feminism is this idea of talking from your perspective of feminism. But like, it can apply to other forms of oppression as well, just standpoint theory in general. A black person is going to understand more about racism. A gay person is going to understand more about homophobia. That's the basic of standpoint theory, and people need to fucking learn how to respect that. Like, again, this is your lived experience. This is your standpoint. You have a right to talk about that. And it's a horrific form of violence, and that they're trying to take that away from you. It's that alienation I'm on about. This attempt to separate you from your trauma, your experience, etc., based on nothing other than the fact that you are a trans man.
And also there's also a lot of separation of trans men from current threats that we face and our material needs. The very obvious one is things like gynecological and obstetric care.
Yes. You previously
this idea that trans men don't need that or shouldn't be included in the conversation, and that's ridiculous.
We previously did we actually did a video covering that at some point, in which trans men just like they were being pushed out of medicine, and that was putting them at greater risk of cervical cancer, etc. So that there is there's a lot of issues here. We also have to understand how everything intersects as well, because in spite of the fact that these conversations happen on a global platform with many different demographics, the attacks always come in assuming that it's also just white trans men. I will say this as well. You do see how very often the sorts of people that are making these arguments are also going after black trans men or trans men of other ethnicities, and they use the same rhetoric that they use with in regards to white trans men as a way to get around their racism towards black trans men, etc. We also need to understand that the experiences of trans men are also incredibly varied. Rodrigo from Peru has a very different experience to Malte and everyone else, to you, etc. We also have to understand that racism intersects with things in different ways. Black trans men are not given the same privileges that white trans men are. We previously covered Tony McDade in a video that I did. I think I had you check it. I think you were my editor at the time.
Yes.
In which he was murdered by police, and like Fred Sargent, the fucking cop who calls the police on Stonewall and has since become a Stonewall veteran in the eyes of the gender critical crowd, he was openly cheering this. Black trans men are not offered the same leniency that people argue white trans men are. I do realize that there's also a racial element, but there's also the fact that even white trans men aren't necessarily offered this. There's also that as well. I don't want to say like white trans men have everything perfect by comparison, but there's a hierarchy involved here, I should state.
As a white trans man, and of course, my opinion is the most important as a white trans man, I feel like the trans community is not a safe place for me. I feel like I have no support. I feel like I'm constantly under attack. And so you can imagine how much worse it must be being a trans man of color, especially with these very nasty people who seem to make it their mission to attack trans men, specifically targeting them, feeling like they can get around race. Like when I get attacked, I have to do something specifically to piss these people off. So yeah, I'm really struggling I'm really struggling with white privilege protecting me. So of course, trans men of color are going to have it much, much, much worse.
There's a reason I was okay giving the name of the white trans man we quoted earlier, but the black trans man that was being attacked, I just don't want to give his name because he was also attacked recently in another way by a certain large YouTuber. I just don't want to add to that. I don't know them personally, so I can't ask them, etc. So I can't ask him. I just didn't want to add that to his plate. But there's a reason I'm treating these two cases differently because I'm afraid for him.
And just a little while ago, I remember there was some discourse about this, about how trans men are soft and get the benefit of the doubt and are tapping into the vulnerable white woman privilege. Of course, they didn't say vulnerable white. They're like, oh, you're just presenting yourselves as vulnerable women. And I saw some people as well pointing out this is, I think I may have been part of that as well, saying this is specifically vulnerable white women. Like this is only a thing white people can tap into. And people were saying, no, all trans masks can do this. And we're like, no, that's only white people can do that. And they're like, no, all of them. And we're attacking people because of that lie they made up.
And we can see that in Mallory's post. I believe she also mocked men and race, men and disability, men and sexuality. She knows what she's doing. She knows that there's so many factors to consider here, and yet she is just bulldozing the entire thing. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add before we move on, because we actually found some studies that we just like to go over quickly. I
There
don't know if you.
there are a few points actually. Yeah. I'll try and go through this a bit more quickly. But I wanted to talk about how Mallory said, I don't think trans men have the same status as cisgender men.
Mhm,
And this is something I've seen come up all the time as well. Where it's empty words. People will say, yeah, no, trans men are not the same as cis men, and then go
mhm,
ahead and okay, not treat us the same as cis men, actually treat us worse than cis men, pretend we're even more privileged than cis men.
mhm.
But well, so oh yeah, you're definitely different to cis men. Yeah, you're trans. Yeah, you experience oppression, and then we'll talk like Mallory is and basically say, "How dare you? Other people have it worse. You don't have it that bad. You don't have historical oppression uh, factoring in." Um, and that's just it's even on top of the Darvo. There's
Mhm.
even more gaslighting there and basically saying, yeah, I'm not doing the thing, and then
Yeah.
just doing it and acting like because you said you didn't, that means that you're not doing it. Um, and I guess I also this thing with uh, Transmisandry isn't worth considering because it's not historical
Mhm.
is I really hate that assumption that it has to have deep roots and that you have to be able to go back 100, 200, 300 years and dig stuff up for it to be a problem.
It's also
First of all, you
completely
can.
ahistorical. I'd say it's just ahistorical. Like people will see when I do the first video on trans history and sports, like all of the earliest cases of trans people, like in sports, like famous trans people in sports, were trans men and they were being targeted.
Hmm.
It's only when we get past the Cold War that trans women actually start becoming the focus. So let's continue.
And yeah, also there was that trans man who one of the first attacks on trans people's legal rights, or maybe not one of the first, but like a major one in history was because a trans man was about to get a baronetcy and people didn't like that. And so there's historical examples, and then there's also some pretty major recent examples like the Bell v. Tavistock case that was targeting
Yeah.
trans men and trans masks. And that had massive implications for the entire trans community. Like you
Hmm.
can't act like there wasn't oppression going on there. Um, and then there's also the fact that a lot of transmisandry, at least that I have seen and I've experienced, it is fairly new because it is abusing feminist rhetoric. And so it's only once feminism have become entrenched in the zeitgeist and had become a thing that people, I guess, largely view as a good thing, that this kind of transmisandry could become a thing. So
Yeah.
it is fairly recent, but does that mean it's not a problem?
Mhm.
Well, no. We're seeing trans men getting abused within the community, and there's also there's this argument that like it doesn't happen in the mainstream and therefore it's not a big deal, while trans men are being abused within the trans community to the point where we feel guilty, we feel unsafe, we don't want to transition because we're convinced we're being bad people
Mhm.
by doing that. And it's ridiculous to say, oh, but cis people aren't doing it, so it's not a problem. Cis people aren't doing it, so you're not being oppressed. When they're very real material harm being done.
There's a hierarchy within the trans community that needs to be acknowledged. That's something that's also very important. Like, and being iced out of that community is fucking
Mm.
horrific. Like, yeah, it's just
Yeah, like
feeling like you
I'm
don't belong to your own community when the world wants you dead. It really it just continues to drain you.
for months now, I have been thinking, I don't think I can be part of the trans community anymore. I don't think I can be a feminist anymore because I keep getting hurt.
Mhm,
Uh, but where else can I go?
mhm,
Can I hang out with cis women? That's honestly just as bad. Hang out with cis men? That's even worse. So I'm just kind of stuck.
mhm.
And that's really bad at the best of times. And this really is not the best of times. Um, I keep seeing these ridiculous arguments like, oh, it isn't systemic, it doesn't fit the definition of oppression or whatever. And I mean, like, definitions are important for a lot of things, but in this case, I don't care. Like, I don't care how we define it. What I care about is that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. I'm so sick of people playing a game of dictionary and quibbling over whether or not this meets the definition of the thing that we have decided is important. What I care about is that this is an important issue.
I also question the idea that it's not systemic, considering statistics we'll go on to in a bit.
And also considering like we have the exact people using the exact same arguments over and over and over again to make trans men shut up. It seems pretty systemic. But yeah, moving on. This whole what about male rape victims thing. This comparison really rubs me the wrong way because again, they're ignoring context, they're ignoring behavior. What's happening to trans men is we try to talk about our issues and stuff, and we are silenced and abused and erased. And then the people who are doing that will turn around and say, why aren't you supporting us? Why aren't you helping us? Why aren't you being a good ally? And so, like, imagine if cis male rape victims were trying to set up groups for themselves and talk about what they've been through, and then women who've been raped will come along and saying, "How dare you? I'll have you know that like rape culture doesn't affect men," which isn't true, and that there's this whole system and like women have it worse and it happens to us more and stuff. And so, you know, how dare you talk about this? You're not focusing on us enough. And just like saying, you need to support us. You need to be a good ally to us. If those men then turned around and said, what about our issues? Why aren't you ever talking about our issues? Why are we only ever talking about yours? I think that would be understandable. I think that would be pretty justifiable, actually.
It's about who's coming into whose circle. That's key here. Just the fact that we're talking about this, some people are going to take as you invading this space, and it's like, no, we're very open at the start of every stream that we're trying to incorporate many different experiences. Like there are limits to what we can do, like what we can do, etc. But we do try that.
Yeah. I just want to say a second to say thank you, Artos Bear. That means a lot to me. Yeah, it's frustrating. Like it's bad enough constantly having people bang down the door and say, how dare you talk about yourselves? But then there's also like isolated posts saying, oh, we need trans men. We need their support. And it's like, excuse me. I prefer a bit of solidarity here.
Yeah.
Actually, when I was attacked for apparently being transmisogynistic for saying that people I did one of my posts on Transmisandry and I had the audacity to say, you know, a trans man was receiving some really vicious hate for just saying that transmisandry exists. And I'm like, no one does this to trans women if they say transmisogyny exists. And because I had the audacity to say that a bad thing happens to trans men that doesn't happen to trans women, I got quite vicious hate for that. And someone was saying, oh, this does happen to us all the time. You're just not listening. You would know if you listened. And I'm like, oh, I'm really sorry. I've never seen this. I've never heard of this. I'd like to learn more. Do you have any examples you could show me so I can learn more about the issue? Trying to be diplomatic there. This person completely refused, just said, oh, you need to listen more, as if I haven't been. And then someone did give me an example. And it was not a trans woman just saying, transmisogyny exists. It was a very long thread where a trans woman was like, trans men are awful and need to stop talking so much and also need to support trans people more because we need you. And that's the thing that really gets me, is the double-pronged attack of how dare you advocate for yourselves, but also give us support, give us resources. The other thing that really annoys me about this, the other thing that's really wrong about this, is that there is a difference, a very crucial difference between cis men suffering under patriarchy and trans men suffering from targeted violence.
Yeah.
Now, to be completely clear, I'm not saying that cis men suffering under patriarchy should not be supported and should not be able to ask for support.
Mm-hmm.
I think they absolutely should. And I really want to support cis men as well. But, you know, obviously, cis men breaking down the door, going into spaces for other issues and saying, oh, men are hurting each other, women, trans people, fix it for us, is a really shitty thing to do. But trans men saying, hey, we're being attacked on all sides, help us, uplift our voices, actually acknowledge our issues sometimes, don't have the support going all one way. That is not the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just this idea that trans men are accepted into the patriarchy, and that's like not at all. You're seen as a threat. Like trans men are seen as a threat to the patriarchy. They're not seen as our new brothers in arms. You know?
A really good point I saw this morning on Twitter was that trans men challenge cis men to do better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the only reason that the patriarchy really hates us, but that's definitely a reason why. Another thing I want to touch on is this whole "don't politicize a tragedy" thing.
Yeah,
this is this is a political tragedy that someone who is not a trans man has decided to turn into a thing about, oh, MRA rhetoric is coming back.
Yeah.
And then people who say, hey, don't do that, are being told, how dare you politicize this? Again, it's a thing of like, I'm turning it into a competition and then getting mad when it's a competition.
It's also especially disgusting considering that both of the people we've talked about today are political activists. You know, they engaged in politics, that their lives were political, even without the whole fact that being trans is politicized, you know. So to come along and say, oh, you shouldn't politicize this, it's like, yeah, I'm no, that's just
and it's
fucked up in every way.
Yeah, it's very bad faith, and like we all know why they're doing this. It's not because they think it's disrespectful to politicize this man's death. They don't care about him. They made that very clear, or any trans man. They're doing this because it's a way to make sure we never discuss why he was killed and how to prevent this sort of thing from happening.
Yeah.
And then the final thing I want to talk about before we move on to the studies is that this whole thing, it gives me it makes me feel like the goal here is control. We have primarily women, but ultimately people who are not trans men inserting themselves into trans men's issues and policing how trans men talk about trans men. And in this and other interactions I've seen, interactions I have been a part of, there's it seems like the goal is not to make things better. The goal is not to make sure people are happy and healthy and protected. The goal is to control the conversation. The goal is to center the people who they want to be centered. And
one of the things to consider is
awful.
One of the things to consider is the fact that the term transmisandry, terms are created for a reason, right? And we can look at those reasons to see if they are good. You know, the label MRA was created to pretend like fucking misogynists actually cared about men's rights. You know, that was
people
false.
Who criticize those misogynists don't care about men's rights.
That was false, but like you can still see there's a purpose there. Why do trans men create the term transmisandry, for example? They create it because their experiences are significantly different to any other community, and they'd like a term that they can use to like encompass that experience, really, to make it easier to talk about. You know, that's what they're doing. Some people might wonder why we use transmisandry, why not transandrophobia or
Transandromism or
anti-transmasculinity.
anti-transmasculinity, yeah.
And the reason we talk about that is because it's just the simplest term, okay? It is the simplest one to go through. I went back and forth on this one. We actually debated this. Hey, Phoenix. We actually debated this a couple of times, and I went back and forth on it. Because we got into the linguistics of it. I just want to say to anyone who's here saying, well, transmisandry, implies that misandry exists. No, it doesn't. We as a trans community have already agreed upon this in our linguistics. How do you know? Simple. We say trans space woman, not trans woman. Why do we say trans as an adjective rather than trans woman as a noun? We say that because having trans as an adjective states that, okay, they are a woman in whole, but they have the trans experience. It's added on, it's an addition. Whereas trans woman in one word
It's a
suggests,
descriptor.
yeah, this is good. Trans woman as one word suggests that trans women are separate to real women. So when it comes to transmisandry, if we were talking about trans space misandry, okay, that would imply misandry was a real thing, because trans there would be acting as an adjective. But we're not. We're talking transmisandry one word, which implies it is a concept completely separate in existence to misandry, in the same way that trans woman as a single word would imply trans women are separate to women.
I'm so glad that you brought this up, actually, because I want to point out that people who have an issue with transmisandry as a term very often compare it to transmisogyny, because we don't want to make things a competition, but everything about trans men must be compared to things about trans women and kind of live within those pre-established rules, because consistency, I guess. So they compare it to transmisogyny and say transmisogyny is transphobia and misogyny mixed together. However, that is not true. And I thought at the time, that's weird. If I was saying misandry and transphobia mixed together, I'd say trans-misandry probably. And I looked at the transmisogyny primer by sorry, what's her name? Julia Serrano. Julia Serrano herself. And in that, it is written trans-misogyny because when she came up with the term, she conceptualized it as transphobia and misogyny mixed together. But as people talked about it more and got to understand transmisogyny more, they realized actually these things are it's its own distinct thing. These things are too enmeshed to be considered separate, and that's why we have transmisogyny, one word.
Same as misogynar and transmisogynar. Like you can't separate or distinguish. Like it's not just a mixing. It's its own distinct set of principles and discriminations.
So yeah, I guess learn your history. Also, this isn't and language. Actually, I want to share this quickly just because I find it kind of funny. Is a common argument that people make is that if you talk about transmisandry, then cis men will take that as proof that misandry exists. And I don't like this because it is punishing trans men for what you think cis men are going to do.
Yeah.
But also, I learned that it's completely irrelevant because for ages I did talk about transandrophobia just to get people off my back. And guess what happened? Cis men came along and was like, see, look at how he's talking about how trans men are treated horribly. This means that I, as a cis man, am oppressed. Yeah. It doesn't matter what words you use. They're acting in bad faith. They're going to say oh, look, a man is talking about he's being treated badly because he's trans. I, as a cis man, am oppressed. Yeah. So yeah, if you have an issue with transmisandry, please just chill out. Like, we thought about this. We know what we're doing. I promise.
Yeah. Anyway, some study times. I've just got a chain of 3 studies I'd like to go over because this whole time we've been talking about this, we've been giving the good faith assessment that trans women are oppressed more than trans men in every single way, in every single facet. And when I actually looked at the research, that just wasn't the case. I tried to have a nap before the stream because I'm a little tired. I've been up since midnight. It is now 6 o'clock here, 6 p.m. I tried to have a little nap and sadly failed. Ended up looking up research because I'm just me. This is going to get... What?
You drank iced tea.
I drank iced tea. That wasn't a good idea. Anyway, this is going to get pretty dark. I should probably say that first. The first study was lifetime sexual assaults, and I'm going to read them out in order from the lowest to highest. So cross-dressers, 19% had suffered lifetime sexual assault. Trans women came next at 37%. AMAB non-binary came next at 41%. Trans men came next at 51%. And AFAB non-binary came next at 58%. This is from the US Transgender Survey of 2015. You can find it on page 205. Then I found another study, which was some statistics from 2011 that was cited in a 2015 paper by Forge Forward. It says FTM and MTF. I'm not really a fan of that language, but I don't know if they included non-binary people and how that fit into everything. And, so I'm just going to have to use the language they use, sadly. F to M suffered higher rates of child sexual assault, adult sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking than M to F. Meanwhile, M to F suffered higher rates of hate violence. Of course, that is quite an old piece of research from, again, 2011. Have things changed? Well, in regards to hate violence particularly, I actually found a third study, and this was a study conducted it was published in 2018, that was looking at the period between the 2016 US elections, so November of 2016, and May 2017, and recording how many trans men versus trans women had experienced, hate speech, hate crimes, etc. And do you want to read the quote out?
Sure. Quote, half of trans men, 50%, reported having experienced hate speech, compared with 24.4% of trans women and 24.4% of genderqueer/non-binary individuals. And 35% of trans men reported having experienced discrimination since the election, compared with 17.8% of trans women and 12.8% of genderqueer/non-binary individuals. No other group differences were found, end quote.
So, again, this is a very specific period. This is after the incredibly charged 2016 campaigns in which trans people were being blasted on all fronts. And yet, when we look at the hate crimes in relation to this, though noted it's not violent hate crimes, it's specifically hate speech and hate speech and discrimination. Trans men were the targets. They were the main targets. They were experiencing at a much higher rate, almost double in some cases. So this idea that trans men have everything magically better just doesn't hold water. Now, things might have shifted as narratives have continued, etc. Again, this is still 2017. It's 5 years ago. That is something that's scary to say. COVID has really done a number on times. But things could have changed. But it's important to note that this idea that's sort of taken for a given, that trans men have everything better, just doesn't stand. It's also important to note that almost all of the discourse on this matter just compresses violence down to hate violence. As we saw in the second study, there are many different forms of violence, and trans men suffer higher rates than other people, than trans women. And relating to that, I kind of want to explain why I feel the need to keep bringing this up and push Levi into talking about this on the stream, etc. The reason I feel so strongly about this, even though I'm not a trans man, the reason I dare say I empathize, not sympathize on this, is because I've seen the exact same bullshit pulled with the bisexual community. We always hear as bisexual people that we have straight privilege, that we can hide things if we choose, that we can just, we've got the best of both worlds, never as bad as it is for gay and lesbian people. And yet we have the highest rates of domestic violence and sexual violence. specifically because we're bisexual. So, I do feel that there's a similar sort of horrific rewriting of what's actually occurring going on here. Uh, like these studies, again, there are limitations to them, as there are with all studies, but I haven't seen any research to the contrary. I can only go on what I can see, and what I can see is the narratives about trans men are completely fucked. Okay? They are completely out of touch with reality. So I don't know if you've got anything to add there.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about since we're talking about studies, something I've seen is this extremely selective criticism of studies and honestly like hostility towards studies. I saw this one study, it may be one of these three, basically saying, basically saying, hey, we looked into it and it looks like trans men actually experience higher rates of most forms of violence than
That would be
other
the
trans
second one.
people.
That would be the second one.
Possibly.
Sorry,
Oh
continue.
yeah, Forge. I think it was, yeah, the
It
Forge
was
study.
Forge. It was the Forge one.
Yeah, I think it was the Forge study. And a bunch of some people were saying this is MRA nonsense. It's statistics. I'm not saying that statistics are completely unbiased, but like I don't think people who are researching trans people are the sort of people who are going to fudge statistics that badly. I don't think they're the sort of people who would fudge statistics at all, especially not in that direction. They're just saying it's MRA. It's MRA stuff because it's suggesting that men have problems that should be addressed. And there was this one person, this absolute ghoul in the replies, who was like nitpicking, saying, "Oh, trans men apparently experience high rates of child sexual assault, but is that because they're trans men, or is that because they're perceived as girls? So is this really a problem trans men face?" Oh, and that boils my blood as, I experienced sexual assault as a child. And it's really difficult to know, was that just because I was assigned female at birth, or did me being a trans man factor in? I don't know. I'm not in my assailant's head. But that is a problem that trans men deal with because that is a trauma that massively affects me today.
Yeah.
And in fact, you know what? I might as well say it. While I was visiting my wonderful boyfriend in Germany, his mother decided to sexually assault me one day. And I'm now dealing with a situation where I don't feel safe around her. And she doesn't understand that because she's thinking it's not a big deal. And I can't explain to her I was sexually assaulted as a child because I don't know enough German for that. And that's a awful situation to be in that is not entirely unique to trans men, but that's proportionately a situation trans men are going to have to deal with. And this is being boiled down to, oh, this is you're experiencing the same thing as cis women. And the other thing, yeah, hi Higgins. The other thing is that even if we accept, okay, this falls under the experience that cis girls deal with, and we'll lump trans men in there. If we actually try to talk about that from that place, then people are like, how dare you? This is a woman's issue and you're a man. Yeah, and then this person started going on about how this many trans women were murdered and no trans men are murdered. Irony alert there. And just made it about how trans women have it worse, and it was just statistics. Like it was just like, hey, trans men deal with some problems. Maybe we should address that. Nothing about trans men having it nothing about trans women not having it bad. Nothing about we need to ignore trans women so that we can focus on trans men. Just like, hey, trans men have some issues. Let's deal with that. And this study was being called MRA stuff. And like, when have you seen MRAs do a study on anything?
Yeah.
One thing I do want to mention is that in reply to that awful person, there were a whole bunch of people, and a lot of them were trans women, calling this person out, not only on the transmisandry, but also on the racism of being a white trans woman appropriating the murders of trans women, which are mostly trans women of color. So I do want to emphasize that these awful trans women who are attacking trans men are a loud minority of assholes.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is this very violent response where there just shouldn't have been one. And I have seen, again, there's this ridiculous thing where people will make things into a competition and say trans men don't have it as bad and therefore they're not allowed to have problems. And if you dare to bring up studies that suggest that that is not the case, you will either be called, you just be called a transmisogynist, or people will start to nitpick about what's the sample size of the study, what's the scope, what time did it take place, what area did it take place, does it apply here?
Yeah.
And I actually don't entirely dislike this approach. I think it's actually really good to understand the scope of a study and how much it applies, and to be aware of the limitations of a study. But this isn't academic rigor.
Yeah, it's not like we have a better study to go off. It's not like we have better studies to go off. This is all the evidence we have to inform what we can do.
Yeah, of course, we need to look into it, but people are like, oh, we shouldn't look into it because trans men are privileged. Because and they're like, see, there's no evidence that they're not.
Well, guess me
and
about.
You say, well, look into it, and they're like, but trans men are privileged. We don't need to look into it because there's no evidence that they're not privileged. And then you show them indications that may not be the case, and they say, well, it's not enough. And if you try and say, well, let's look into it, they'll say, but trans men are privileged. We don't need to look into it. And it strikes me as very bad faith. And what really gets me is on the flip side, like they're so cynical about these studies, but then the evidence that they'll go around saying that trans women have it worse than trans men. And you're supposed to just take people at their word on that.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't mind that too much, except I've actually seen people explicitly say, if you are a trans man and you say that you have it worse than trans women, you're a transmisogynist. And I don't have a problem with that because I don't like oppression Olympics. I don't like turning things into a competition. Even if we have incontrovertible proof that trans men have it worse than trans women, that's not helpful. That's not healthy or constructive. But then these people have gone on to say, if you say you have it as bad as a trans woman, you're also a transmisogynist. And like, again, I don't want to turn things into a competition. I don't want to go around saying trans men have it just as bad. I don't think that's helpful.
Yeah.
But what that implies is that trans men have to go around saying, oh, yeah, our problems, they're not as bad as trans women's. They're really not that big a deal. We don't need to address them. And that's what they expect. Yeah. And even when you show them evidence to the contrary, that's what they expect. And the reason why, when it comes down to it, I can't help but think about this this explanation I saw of the difference between conclusions and rationalizations. I think it illustrates it very beautifully. So I just want to outline. Imagine you have an essay trying to prove whether or not the moon is made of cheese. And you start at the top and you write down all your data, your observations, your whatever. And then at the bottom you say, and therefore the moon is made of cheese or not made of cheese or whatever. That there's a conclusion. You've done the research, you've looked into it, and you've come up with the best guess you can. But then rationalizations is when you go to the bottom and you write, and therefore the moon is or is not made of cheese. And then you go up the top and you write all sorts of arguments supporting that conclusion, but they're not grounded in reality. And it's very clear that these very nasty, violent people who are going around attacking trans men have written at the bottom of the page, trans men are not oppressed, trans men don't have it as bad as trans women have it the worst. And then they've gone to the top and they've written all sorts of arguments. And if you show them, hey, that's not actually true, they're saying, how dare you? Trans women have it worse. See, it's at the bottom of my essay here.
It's the creationist approach to science. Here's the evidence. How do I make it fit? Not.
And the thing is, they've defined not agreeing with them that trans women have it worse as transmisogyny. And like that wouldn't be that big a problem, except they're using trans women have it worse as an excuse to not only center themselves in their own on their own platforms, but also attack trans men talking about ourselves on our own platforms, demand that trans men give more attention, more support. Like, it's at the point where there was a time when I used to, if something horrible had happened to trans women that the trans community was talking about, I used to refrain from talking about anything to do with trans men because I was worried that people would say, how dare you? Why aren't you talking about trans women? And so it's this thing where you're getting attacked, and then if you defend yourself, that's being defined as bigotry, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's just important to keep in mind, regardless of how people fucking frame things. Like, if nothing else, these statistics show that there is a fucking problem, and it needs to be talked about and fixed. You know, the fucking language behind it, whether it's worse or the same or whatever, you know, because even these studies, whilst they looked at different forms of violence, they did not look at everything. Like, you can't, for example, compute the psychological impact of constantly being presented as a predator. You know, how does that impact the person? I can't remember if the survey I used to look at in regards to trans youth suicide, I can't remember if they distinguish between trans women and trans boys and trans girls. I'll have to probably go back. The Trevor Project survey, I'll have to go back and look at that at some point. So, like, there are other ways that violence, like, can be different. So, you know, but, like, regardless of that, there's an issue here and it needs to be tackled, you know? And that's the main thing to keep sight of, regardless of anything. It's not fucking misogyny to talk about this issue. Okay, it is legitimate, it is massive, and it needs tackling. But,
sorry, I just remembered quickly. One thing as well is so people are really selective and cynical when it comes to studies showing that trans men have it worse. But these same people turn around and be like, oh, I found a study that says that actually trans men don't have it that bad and trans women have it worse, and see, like, this proves. And again, it's just the double standards. So much of what infuriates me is just that these rules are not consistent.
Yeah. I mean, they pulled a Sargon earlier when they went, oh, statistics. Yeah, statistics from surveys, which is how all sexual violence, like, statistics are taken from. You know who did the exact same thing? Sargon of fucking Akkad. Sorry, Carl Benjamin of Swindon. That's Swindon? I can't remember where he's from.
Carl of Swindon, yeah.
It is Swindon, yeah. But he did this as well when feminists were talking about statistics. He was like, but those statistics came from a survey as opposed to these statistics. And it's on, like, the same page that he was reading off on, like, the next column. These statistics were taken from a survey because that is how they are gathered. The only other way would be to observe every crime happening, which not possible, or take police statistics. Do you really want to trust the police to talk about hate crimes? I don't. So, like,
in fairness, I don't think they're attacking it because it's from a survey. I think they're attacking it because, like, trans men having problems, that's impossible. They have male privilege.
I get that, but, like, the whole mention of ICE survey kind of thing, you know, it's
yeah.
That's how you get the data.